We'll get started in just a few minutes. We're going to let just a few more people in. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started just to respect everyone's time. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Maddie, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist for Education here at WFYI. Here at WFYI, our mission is to provide trusted journalism, inspiring stories, and lifelong learning. Our vision is to have an informed, inspired, and inclusive Indiana. WFYI is committed to representing rich diversity in our community and amplifying stories and experiences that represent the experiences of all. We want to thank you for joining us this evening and hope you will find the information helpful. Here's a couple reminders. We will be sending a follow-up email after the webinar, probably tomorrow. This email will contain a variety of resources, a post-video survey, and links to the recordings of tonight's webinar, as well as the one from last week. You can also watch them directly on our YouTube channel. You can submit questions during the webinar in the Q&A chat on your screen, and these webinars are not legal advice. We would like to thank Ability Allies, Indiana Disability Rights, and IEP Hope for their contributions and participation in today's webinar. Moderating today, we have Dylan Peers McCoy. Dylan Peers McCoy is an award-winning journalist with more than a decade of experience covering education, families, and communities. Her reporting has prompted Indiana to return schools to local control, increase scrutiny of graduation rates, and exposed how the state violated federal law by allowing people with emergency permits to teach special education. From Ability Allies, we have Mimi Huybers. Mimi represents parents and students in legal matters arising under the Individuals with Disability Act, Article 7, and Section 504. She presents frequent trainings and seminars about special education matters to parents and professional groups. She is also an adjunct faculty member at the IU School of Education in Indianapolis. From Indiana Disability Rights, we have Jim Hutton. Jim Hutton is a senior attorney with Indiana Disability Rights, also known as IDR. Jim leads the education team at IDR, advocating for students with disabilities to receive free, appropriate public educations in the least restrictive environment through the use of individualized education programs, IEPs, and 504 plans, and for schools to properly address incidents of bullying of students based on their disabilities. Jim has been with IDR since March 2022. Prior to that, Jim practiced as a civil litigation attorney for over 25 years, primarily in the areas of tort and insurance defense litigation. From IEP Hope, we have Laura Swanson. Laura has been a visit supervisor as well as a CASA trainer and volunteer coordinator. She has been the regional program specialist before founding IEP Hope in 2021. Laura has been an advocate for children with disabilities and their families for almost 20 years. Dylan, let's get started.
So this webinar was inspired in part by our reporting on suspensions across Indiana over the last year. That reporting started because we got data from the state that showed that suspensions had increased post-pandemic from where they were before the pandemic. And that data was pretty granular. It shows demographic details on students, like whether or not the students getting suspended have disabilities or in special education or in general education. In our analysis of that data, what we found was that students with disabilities are suspended far more frequently than their peers in general education. This is a national pattern, but we looked closely at what was happening in Indiana over the last few years. And what that showed was that in 2023-24, students in special education made up about 17% of enrollment. When you looked at incidents of suspension, they made up about 33% of enrollment. So we decided to dig in a little bit on why that is and what that means for students and families. When you look at that data, the way that that data breaks down is that essentially students in special education, there were 22 incidents of out-of-school suspension for every 100 students. By comparison, for students in general education, there were about 10 incidents of out-of-school suspension for every 100 students. So it's more than twice as frequently. That being said, those are state averages, and actually these numbers vary widely from school to school. So the analysis for this, the data analysis for this reporting, that last graphic I showed you, and this database came from my colleague, Zach Castle. If you go on our website, we have a database that shows by school district what these ratios of suspension incidents per 100 students are for students in general education and for students in special education for districts around the state. Because of privacy reasons, we don't have information at the school level, but we do have it at the district level. And you see there's enormous variation, both in terms of how frequently students in general education are suspended and students in special education. So I just pulled up this chart with specifically schools in Tippecanoe County because it's an area I'm a little bit familiar with. I used to work there briefly. And what you can see is that some school districts in Tippecanoe are suspending students in special education far more frequently than others. There's similar variation around the state. That doesn't tell you why this variation happens from district to district. Based on my reporting on Tippecanoe, I can tell you that the West Lafayette Community Schools is very different from the Lafayette Schools Corporation in terms of the demographics of the students they're serving. There are a lot of students in that school district whose parents are professors or staff at Purdue University. And that obviously is a different demographic population. But you do see this variability. And I think that if you are a parent trying to understand what's happening in your school district or trying to choose a school, this can be a helpful jumping off point. This is a community that also has a Paramount School of Excellence, which is part of a charter school network around the state. So we did some reporting specifically on Paramount after hearing from parents about the really high suspension rates at Paramount. Paramount runs 8 schools in Indiana. Those serve elementary and middle school students. And based on our analysis of state data, Paramount suspended students with disabilities about 3 times more often than the state average last school year. From our reporting and talking to parents and school administrators at Paramount, what we came to understand is that the high suspension rates for students with disabilities actually reflect a broader high suspension rate in these schools. So Paramount schools also have really high suspension rates for students in general education. And talking to Tommy Reddix, who leads Paramount schools, he basically said they have calm hallways, they have calm classrooms. And one way that they maintain calm hallways and calm classrooms is by having fairly strict discipline. So they have high suspension rates because of a culture of strict discipline and an approach they have school wide. For some parents we spoke to, that was desirable. They were happy to have their child at a school that had that focus on academics. And even parents of students with disabilities who were fairly frequently suspended said that they thought that it was appropriate for their behavior and that they were really happy that they were at this school. That being said, we also talked to a lot of parents who felt like the school was too strict and it wasn't a school where students with behavioral challenges, including and particularly students with disabilities, could thrive and fit in. They felt like they were being told that their children didn't belong at this school. Okay. This data is from the Fairbanks Foundation. This can be another good place to look if you want to understand a little bit more about what's going on with discipline around the state. And they looked at, rather than looking at incidents of suspension, which would show if Dylan McCoy was suspended 5 times in the school year, it would show 5 incidents of suspension. The Fairbanks data is looking at unique students. So I think that can be helpful for understanding a little bit more about how this is playing out. So a student, it doesn't say how often students are suspended, but it says how many students experience suspension during that school year. And in 2023-24, almost 12% of students with disabilities were suspended, compared to about 5% of students in general education. That's a much higher rate, but it's still really low compared to the overall population of students. That's about 1 in 10 students. I think it's helpful to understand that a lot of students with disabilities don't end up facing suspension in most school years. Maybe they don't have discipline issues, or the discipline issues don't rise to a level where the school suspends them. That being said, on the flip side, there are students who face suspensions over and over again. In our reporting for these stories, we spoke to students and parents who'd been dealing with suspensions year after year since their children started school. We did these sort of focus groups with students where we just asked them about their experience, when was the first time they were suspended. And a lot of students said the first time they were suspended was in kindergarten, preschool, first grade. One of the students that ended up being central to one of our stories is Bella, and she was first suspended in kindergarten. And we looked at school records on that. And she continued to be suspended repeatedly, year after year. And that really took a toll on her, both in terms of the missed instruction that she missed, because when you have students who are suspended day after day, they can end up missing a lot of school time, and also an emotional toll. When we talked to her mom, she recalled a time when she said to her, Mom, why am I so bad? Why did God make me like this? And so I think that really illustrates that suspensions, it's not just an incident that happens one day and then you move on from. For some students, that is. Maybe students are only suspended once, but for students that are suspended over and over again, this can be really a defining part of their experience in school. There's a really big question about why students in special education are suspended more often than students in general education. And I'm not going to offer a definitive answer. I think there are probably a lot of answers. But what I heard from experts a lot of times is that the behaviors that schools are suspending students for are tied to their disabilities. So students with autism or ADHD might have more trouble controlling their reactions, right? So an incident that starts off fairly small and for a student that's better at regulating their emotions might not become a big incident, can become something that really spirals, and then a school eventually suspends them for that. And that might be because of their disability, and it also sometimes is because teachers aren't really well equipped to deal with those behavioral issues. So in the case of Bella, there was an incident where her teacher wanted her to sit in a particular spot during class. She wanted to sit in a different spot. They were arguing back and forth about it, and school records showed like this argument continued to escalate. And eventually it got to the point where her teacher locked her out of the classroom. She had a meltdown. They called an ambulance, and she was suspended for 2 days for defiance for an incident that started out with her and her teacher butting heads over what spot she sat in class. Um, we talked to a lot of parents that had similar examples of things that were, by the time the student was suspended, their behavior was maybe more extreme, but what actually triggered it in the beginning was part of a normal spectrum of human behavior, I think. It particularly student teachers in general education might not necessarily receive really strong training in how to deal with behavioral challenges with students. So in talking to experts, we heard that special education teachers often got more training on this than general education teachers. Some of the teachers we talked to told us that what they learned about how to deal with student behavior was once they started the job. They learned that from peers, they learned that in schools, and they didn't get that much training when they were education students themselves. And then I think when we talk about any challenge in special education, it's helpful to keep in mind that a lot of times special education classrooms are really understaffed. They might not have as many teachers as they should. They might not have as many support staff as they should. Maybe they're fully staffed, but that actually still isn't as many staff as it would take to deal with students with the kind of challenges that they're facing. We also had school administrators basically tell us that they tried to reduce student suspensions among students with disabilities, but they were still going to suspend students for violent behavior, for dangerous behavior. They wanted to communicate to their staff that when they were hurt, they were taking it seriously. They wanted to foster a calm environment for other schools for other students in the schools so that they also had an opportunity to learn. So those are some of the other things that we heard from folks in our reporting. And then I just wanted to go back to this data, this chart that we did that illustrates why we got interested in the first place, which is that Indiana's been trying to reduce suspensions across the board for a long time and had been having fairly decent success with that. Then there was a huge drop in suspensions during the pandemic, which makes sense because lots of students weren't in schools during that time. And then as students came back to schools after the pandemic, we saw a spike in suspensions, and we saw it really rebound to levels it hadn't been at for years. A lot of educators said that they were seeing more behavioral challenges among all students post-pandemic than they'd been seeing before. It looks like there's a dip is happening again. We've looked at slightly more recent data from 2024, 25, that also seem to suggest that schools are reducing suspensions. But we thought this was an important issue to focus on now because of that spike we'd seen post-pandemic.
All right, we are going to get started with the panel portion of our webinar tonight. We did take questions ahead of time, but again, feel free to put any questions in that Q&A box on your screen. We may not get to everyone's, but we will be sending, like I said, a follow-up email after this with all sorts of resources, tools, contact information from some of these organizations and so forth. Again, we have Jim, Mimi, and Laura here with us today, and I'm going to get us started. So for question one, I'm going to start us off with Mimi. Can schools discipline or suspend students with disabilities for behaviors that are manifestations of their disability? Yep.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Maddie. So schools, this might be a somewhat surprising answer because folks sometimes think that they cannot discipline students with disabilities at all. And then the whole question of whether or not it's real manifestation of their disability is another aspect of your question. I just want to maybe explain to our audience that participants that when we're talking about manifestation, sometimes that's a word that folks haven't heard before. And so I just wanted to explain that that just really means is it directly and substantially related to the student's disability. And so really the answer is yes, they can, but they can only do that up to 10 days. And that's a general, 10 days general, because there are some other factors that, because nothing is ever cut in stone and a completely straight answer, but generally up to 10 days, a student, even if their behavior is related to their disability, directly related to their disability, the student can be disciplined. But then after that 10 days, the student has extra protections kick in, and schools have to go through some extra steps. And I know we're going to talk about those later, so I will stop right there, unless you have follow-up questions regarding that particular aspect.
We do have a follow-up question from one of our participants, and I'm going to say, while I may ask a participant to start us off, any of the panelists are feel free to join in. So the follow-up question to that, can you explain when schools hold manifestation determination meetings and what the purpose of those meetings are? Can schools continue suspending students after they reach that manifestation? Jim, I can have you go ahead and start us off.
Sure, and Mimi had mentioned manifestation, so sort of piggybacking on that. What the Indiana law says is that within 10 days of any of a behavior that could lead to a change of placement, so basically a behavior that could lead to discipline or removal, a case conference committee or the IEP team has to meet to determine whether that student's behavior, let's say they push somebody or they touch somebody that they shouldn't have. They eloped from a room. There could be a lot of behaviors. Within 10 days of taking an action toward a change of placement, there has to be a meeting. And at that meeting, the IEP team looks at all relevant information from the student's file. They look at the student's IEP, the existing IEP. They will review teacher observations about what happened. They may look at witness statements from other students and any other relevant information about that incident to determine if that behavior that they're meeting about there's two questions that they look at. First, the team needs to look at, was that behavior caused by, or did it have a direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability? So that makes sense. Basically, was that behavior caused by the disability? Now, if they say yes, it was caused by the disability, then there are certain actions that IEP team will need to take. Basically, they're going to have to look at establishing what's called a behavior intervention plan to try to address ways to minimize or completely get rid of that, or to resolve that behavior. So that's the first question. Now, but there's a second question. Even the other question that they want to look at, the IEP team, is, was that behavior the direct result of the school's failure to properly implement the existing IEP? That's another question. And again, if they determine that the behavior was the direct result of the school's failure to follow and implement the IEP, then again, there won't be discipline, but there will be this need to then look at what that failure was and what needs to change in terms of the implementation of that IEP. So that's what happens with a manifestation determination. It's within 10 days, and it's the IEP team, and they look at those two questions.
Thank you. And this question is for any of our panelists, mainly to tag on. Dylan already kind of addressed and discussed this a little bit in her presentation about why are students with disabilities suspended more frequently than their peers in general education. And while we think there's more than one answer, we wanted to give a chance for any of you to speak on if you also have anything in addition to what Dylan had already mentioned.
I can go ahead.
It's a great question. I don't have a whole lot to add to that, but we do see that certainly in practice. That's something we do see, and but it's very hard to put a finger on the description. Go ahead, Mimi.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Dylan shared some really good factors that can be part of it. I mean, just kind of right from the get-go, one of the big issues is that a part of a student's disability can be symptoms, or that disability can, not to harp on the word manifest, but can manifest itself in the student, the child, through behaviors. And so a lot of times there are challenges with controlling their students' emotions or impulsivity. And a lot of times, depending on the student's disability, they might have difficulty with social skills or communication skills, and not, they know what they want to say, but they can't get it out, and so they act it out, or executive functioning skills. So there are a lot of different things that are just directly related to the disability. But then there can also be the situation where a student with an IEP that has a disability can be maybe labeled by the teacher as being, a behavior kid, a behavior problem, and thus that it's potentially, or there's the potential that teacher might kind of have a shorter fuse when it comes to the student doing something. And the Dylan situation of where these situations blow up as to something that starts with where are you gonna sit on the floor, all of a sudden turns into something humongous. We see a lot of that. So zero tolerance policies. I think sometimes when students who have a disability where they have behaviors, a lot of times their disabilities are what we call invisible disabilities. And I think in those situations, sometimes teachers question whether the student even has that disability, or whether or not the disability is actually causing that behavior, or is it just the student choosing to act out? So Laura, we've done a lot of talking. Go ahead.
I think too, with the individual school districts that Dylan was showing, in my area, we still have a lot of self-contained schools. So that shows a lot of, disproportion. in the maps that Dylan would show, that there still are a lot of self-contained schools where only kids with disabilities go to those schools. So that would show, the big rise in the suspension rates in those areas. So, and here we are in 2025, and we still have, those schools that still exist. So, that would be another reason that we see those high rates in certain areas.
Now this question, I'm going to start with Jim. Is it legal for schools to send students home because of behavior without formally suspending them? I hear from parents a lot of times whose students are sent home without actually being suspended. And does that count as a day of suspension when we're talking about this 10-day limit before you go to manifestation?
Right. So yes, they can do that. Now we're going to, of course, you've heard from Mimi about the importance of whether it's within the first 10 days of it happening or the 11th day and after that. But yes, they can send them home. Does that count as a day of suspension? Yes, it does. It'll count. And really, suspensions, it's really called a removal, a day of removal. The one problem we get into sometime with the word suspension is it can mean different things to different people. And it has certain legal meanings that can kind of confuse things. For the purposes of special education law, what we count are days of removal. And when a student is sent home, that is counted, even if it's for the last half hour. That would, I would argue, be considered a full day of removal for purposes of counting those 10 days. And then once you get past the 10 days, for purposes of requiring that there be a manifestation determination meeting that happens after that. Okay, so that will be counted toward that happening. There's one caveat to that is it is counted as a day of removal unless it is done pursuant to a provision in that student's IEP, because sometimes there can be accommodations written into a student's IEP, which in which the IEP team, which includes the guardian of the student, decide that they are going to use that as an accommodation for that student, that if they are de-escalated under some certain circumstances of their disability, that sometimes they're going to agree to call the guardian, call mom or dad or the guardian to come pick them up. So if it's in the IEP, then no, that would not be a day of removal. But otherwise, yes, it would be.
And
Can I just go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead. I also wanted to quickly ask, what about what would be more like an in-school suspension? So for example, if a student is just sent to the office at school and told to do work while they're a receptionist, how does that factor into this?
That depends.
And then I'll let you step in, Mimi, after this. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. No, go ahead. Yep, go ahead, Jen.
Okay. So that depends. It can, in-school suspension certainly can be, and I would argue often is, a removal, a day of removal for purposes of special education law. However, the Indiana Article 7 provides that an in-school suspension does not count as a removal if there's three things. If the student can continue to progress in their gen ed curriculum, so if they can keep doing the curriculum, number one. Number two, if the student receives the special education and related services described in their IEP, so are they still getting their IEP followed during that time? And then third, and this is the one that there's going to be argument over, if the student participates still with non-disabled students to the same extent as in the student's existing placement. So so it does depend, depending on those three factors. But go ahead, Mimi.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to jump back to the previous question about sending kiddos home without calling it a suspension. School should be sending the student home with some sort of disciplinary paperwork. But we see it all the time that it doesn't happen. And so I just was going to point out that it would be really helpful to families, parents, if they, guardians, whomever, if they track when that occurs, because we'll get calls from a parent and they'll say they've been sending my child home and having me come pick them up all year long, and we'll ask for specific days and they don't have exactly when that occurred. So I would recommend, if you're not getting paperwork regarding discipline, especially if it is being called a suspension, because that happens, then ask for that paperwork. But if nothing else, just in your calendar, on your smartphone, make a note so that you know exactly what's happening on what days and you've got those details.
And I would just also, again, point out though, I agree with everything Mimi has said, but the key thing is whether the school calls it a suspension or doesn't call it a suspension. Absolutely. Makes no difference for the purposes of the rights under the special education law, under the IDEA, okay? Because sometimes that's a bit confusing to people. They think that if it is a suspension, it either does or doesn't apply, versus if they call it something else. The verbiage really doesn't matter. If that student, and that happens quite a bit. We get a lot of kids whose parents feel like they're being called, multiple times a week to come pick up their kids. And so agree with everything Mimi said. The only thing I would say is the key is to make note of those times that happens. Totally agree with that. But don't leave anything out because of what the school decides to call it.
Thank you guys so much. All right, Laura, I have a question for you. When choosing or enrolling in a new school, what questions should parents of children with disabilities ask about their discipline policies and supports?
Excuse me. Well, they should always look up the student handbook and see, what the handbook says. We have a lot of, issues where schools say, well, it's in the student handbook. They should sit and have a meeting with the school to go over their child's IEP and make sure that they can meet all the accommodations of their students' IEP with no problem. Make sure there's no pushback to begin with. They should, tour the school with their child, make sure their, child is feeling comfortable. They should do their homework. How many suspensions, the homework that, that Dylan has done with the suspension rate of the school, the bullying rate of the school, that type of thing. They should attend or talk to other parents with children with disabilities and see how that school really is. You don't want to get into a school district where there's all kinds of lawsuits going on, and then you're stuck, in a house that you just bought and you can't move. So
now we have another question from a participant. Can you share information about when a school can place a student with a disability into an interim alternative educational setting? Mimi, Jim, do either one of you want to take that one?
I'll go ahead and jump in and take that one. So if we think about the situation like Jim was talking about with the manifestation, or really, I guess any discipline well, so back to what Jim was talking about, if either of the questions that he mentioned, the answer is yes. And that those questions again are, is the behavior directly related to the student's disability, or is it the result of the school not following the student's IEP? So if the answer is yes, then what the school is supposed to do is, like Jim talked about, help figure out how to address those behaviors and make sure this doesn't happen through a functional behavior assessment and a behavior implementation plan. But the school's also supposed to return the student to their original placement. So if that's a general education placement or a self-contained setting, they should return to that placement. The school doesn't automatically get to decide, hey, that kiddo, now has to be on homebound because they've acted up and they've had some discipline. There are situations though where a student can be sent to an interim alternative educational setting, IAES, and that's in a situation of a weapon, drugs, or serious bodily injury. And when it comes to serious bodily injury, I would encourage anyone to take a look at what the definition is of that in Article 7, because that is defined and it's pretty substantial. And there is some information even regarding what a weapon is. And so in those situations, the principal can determine that student needs to be in what's called an interim alternative educational setting. So the principal makes that decision, but then the student's case conference committee determines what that interim alternative educational setting will be, and it lasts for 45 days. So the student can get placed in that alternative setting. And I'm not meaning that it's necessarily an alternative school, because that can be confusing to folks. But an alternative setting that the case conference committee decides where the best alternative setting would be for that student.
Thank you, guys. All right.
I would point out that schools will sometimes take a pretty broad view of, for example, what's a weapon. So we've had cases with very young students that poke somebody with a pencil. We've had that happen. We've had kids, again, elementary school age, who have maybe a piece of wood or some sort of piece of plastic or glass that it's broken somewhere, and they literally just pick up a broken piece of something that's in the classroom and are, threatening with it and poke somebody. And those things are called weapons. So you'll run across schools sometimes taking a really broad view of that. I think I would suggest too broad sometimes on what's a weapon.
Thank you. And then Jim, I have another quick question for you. This one did come from a participant, and it appears it came from an educator. What's the best way to handle behavior issues when a school is short-staffed and the child can't get the time that they're usually given?
Yeah, I have sort of a lawyer answer to that. And I will defer to anybody else on the panel who wants to take the more practical side of things from the teacher's point of view, which I don't. I actually did graduate with an education degree a million years ago, but I never was a teacher. What I say is this, from an attorney point of view, is, and I know this is not directly answering the question, but what we run, because we hear this a lot, that, and it goes to maybe another question that might come up later. We hear, look, we don't have enough staff. We don't have the resources. We don't have the staffing. It's just not available. We can't do it. That is a constant issue that we face at IDR. And what I want to make clear on that larger issue is that you're talking about the teacher. And I again, I have so much respect for teachers. I was thinking about being one myself in the job they do. But, the fact of the matter is that the school needs to help that teacher have the resources necessary, because the IEP by law has to be followed. And the school, I'm not blaming the teacher, but the school is saying, well, we just don't have funding to hire another aide, or we can't find an aide, things like that. The law doesn't allow that. That's not an excuse under the IDA. So the thing I think is important from my view as an attorney who advocates on these issues is to, just because we hear this, folks will hear that. The response is, I'm sorry, but school, you need to get the teacher the help needed to follow the IEP, because if that teacher is unable to follow that IEP, then the school is not in compliance with the law. Period. And so I think that will come up sometimes. So that's sort of the lawyerly side of things. I don't have a great strategy for the educators on that, and I would defer to anybody else who might have anything to share.
I have had several times where the parent and the educator have worked together, contacted, me, complaints were filed. knowing that it wasn't on the educator because they were working together. And then, as the complaint process progressed, somebody was hired to help that educator, and the complaint was dropped. And everybody was happy in the end, but it was that relationship of working together to know that it wasn't personal against the teacher. It was the teacher, asking the parent for help also.
This is a little in the weeds, but I'm going to start with Mimi. Can you explain what a functional behavioral assessment is and behavioral intervention plans?
Sure. Keep in mind, though, that I'm not a behaviorist, but I've been to lots of different trainings and heard lots about functional behavior assessments. And so a functional behavior assessment is really looking at the students' patterns of behavior. And so they're looking for, does this happen mostly right before lunch and right after lunch, or when they're coming in from recess? Is there any pattern that's going on with the behavior? And looking at kind of what's the function, or what's the kind of motivation? What is the student getting out of that behavior? And sometimes when I've heard behaviorists talk at different conferences and things, they'll talk about behavior as a form of communication. So this is kind of looking at that behavior and trying to come up with some theories about what's the reason for the behavior and what's motivating that child. What is that child getting out of it? So if it's this right before lunch, is it a hunger issue? Is it as simple as that? Or is it at the end of the school day and maybe that student's gotten some medications and the medications are wearing off? And so that's really what it is. You just asked about FBAs, right? The functional behavior assessment. Did you ask me to answer about behavior plans or no? Sorry.
Yeah, I also asked you to describe behavior plans. And then I was also wondering if any of my panelists could speak to when schools do these. Like, how do these fit into overall school responses to student behavioral challenges?
Okay, so I'll let someone else grab that and I'll finish just on the behavior plan. So once we have a plan in place, or functional behavior assessment done. Like I said, this is just theories as to we're not crawling inside the student's head and looking and seeing what's causing that behavior, because that would be great if we could do that. So we're creating theories based on what we're seeing from these patterns to try to either eliminate triggers or come up with different strategies. We see the students escalating their behavior, and we can tell that this is what's happening whenever they're asked to do math, because math is really hard for this kiddo. And so what can we do? What kind of strategies and de-escalation techniques? And so all of that information of what we're going to do to try to eliminate the behaviors or reduce the behaviors, that's what's going to go in the behavior plan. I'll let someone else jump in.
And I'll jump in
when they're used.
Yeah, first of all, and it can be used anytime. Anytime that there's if the case conference committee or IEP team, again, those get used interchangeably, just decide, this student seems to be struggling with certain behaviors, there's no wrong time for the IEP team to decide, you know what, I really think we need to do an FBA to try to get to the bottom of, why is this student engaging in these behaviors? What's the function? And so it can be any time. And then, as I briefly mentioned before, the one specific time that it needs to happen is when we're past the 10 days, okay, and we have a behavior again. There's already been 10 days of removals. Starting with the 11th, there's a behavior. remember, we then have to have a manifestation determination review to look at was this a behavior related to the disability. If they find that it was, yes, that behavior was related to disability, then the law actually does provide for the IEP team to look at whether there should be an FBA done with a BIP. And if there's an existing one, an existing BIP, then they're supposed to make sure that it doesn't need to be altered or changed. So that's when it can happen. And then just real quick follow up to what Mimi had said, just to give you an idea of the kind of functions that behaviors say that they're looking for. So the things that can be the underlying, the real reason that behaviors are happening with students, the five that I've kind of seen that they sometimes look at just briefly is, so one function would be social attention. So, they're trying to get positive social reinforcement. Kids want attention. Sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes it's so they can access a preferred activity, because perhaps if they know if they do a certain behavior, they always get to go over here and do this thing in the class that they actually like. And so, there can be some incentives inadvertently happening here that we might need to look at removing, right? Sometimes it's escape, delay, or avoidance of things they don't want to do. That happens a lot. Sometimes, kids just don't want to do whatever the activity that's there, and this is the way they're going to be able to avoid doing that activity. And then sometimes, particularly, I think you would see this with students with autism, and it can be other ones. Sometimes it's internal stimulation. So they're basically, it's something that due to their disability, they're getting some internal stimulation, which they find to be, something that is a pleasant feeling for them. So it can be different functions, but again, the purpose is to look at, in that FBA, is to look broadly. Again, when you look at the records, we need to talk to the teacher. There needs to be an in-class observation, and it needs to be at a time that is consistent with when we're seeing the behaviors. If the behaviors are always in the afternoon and we have an hour observation in the morning, well, that's not helping, right? So even the timing of those behaviors makes a difference. So just wanted to just quickly touch on kind of what I had heard. And when I've gone to those conferences as well with the behavioral therapists, and I've been to a few of those too.
This question is for Laura. Other folks are welcome to weigh in. If a parent believes the school is inappropriately disciplining their child, either because the discipline is a violation of their child's rights, or just because the discipline is actually escalating problems, what do you recommend as strategies for changing how schools handle student behavior when you're working with families who think that discipline is a real problem for their child? What do you suggest to them as how they handle this?
I suggest that they call a case conference so that the team can be together, so that they can address their concerns with how the behavior is being addressed, and we can put in the IEP how the behavior is to be addressed, so that it is in the legal document how the behavior is to be addressed, so that going forward, if there are any more concerns, a complaint can be filed if it's not being addressed appropriately.
The other thing I would jump in and suggest is, if the special education director has not already been involved in the matter, I would definitely contact the special education director, have that parent contact the special education director, get that person involved.
Yes.
Dylan mentioned earlier that lots of times there's minimal amount of special education training and regarding how to teach students with disabilities and regarding what the law is. And so the special ed director, though, should be very, very well versed in all of the requirements.
Thank you. All right, my next question is going to be for Jim. Is it legal for a school to say that they cannot provide a particular service? For example, if they say, we do not offer one-on-one aids here.
No, not as just a blanket statement. Again, coming back to what I had said before, the inability to, usually it comes down to funding at the bottom, but because obviously they could have aides if they're willing to pay for them. It depends on whether we're willing to do that. And the fact of the matter is, if the IEP team decides that this student, under the parameters that they look at, is going to benefit from a one-on-one aid, and decides that, then the school needs to make that happen. And saying, we don't do that here, is just simply not something they can do.
Thank you for that. Laura, my next question's for you, and this is kind of on the flip side. Based on just some of your experience, how can a parent figure out if a school is actually prepared to meet their child's needs? For example, do schools have to share with the family if an essential service is contracted out?
As long as the service is being provided, the parent doesn't get to choose who is providing that service. As long as the service is being provided legally to that child. So if a speech therapist is working with the child in, from Florida online, they are receiving that speech service.
This one, I'm going to start with Jim. If a student with disabilities is suspended, is the school required to make up for the special education services they miss?
Well, let me back up a little bit. So let's say that there is a behavior, we're past the initial 10 days, so there's a manifestation determination, and they determine that the behavior was not related to the disability. At that point, the school then can impose the regular discipline that would be imposed on any other student. So it could be a suspension. That's usually where we're going to see the suspensions, right? And the most important thing to remember, I think, is that during that period of suspension, students are still entitled and must be provided with special education services that provide them with a free, appropriate public education. So that needs to happen during the suspension. Now, sometimes that the IEP team, it's going to look a little bit different, the services that are provided and what happens. It might look a bit different during that time, but there are services being provided. So I guess I want to make that point most clear. To the extent that there are situations where there was a suspension and those services were not provided for one reason or another, then yes, then that student, well, like I said, it should be given those anyways. The situation we had run into, I know, for example, which was a tough one, was we had a young student in elementary school who, what was happening was, and it was happening repeatedly by the time they got to us, the student would have a behavior. The school, remember, has then 10 days to schedule that MDR, and they would schedule it in 10 days or so. And in the meantime, the student is sitting at home, not receiving services. They'd have the MDR would, 10 days later, they'd say, oh, it was related. Well, wait a minute. Well, now what do we do? Because the student missed 10 days. And in fact, what was really happening was, no sooner did they determine that the student would come back for one day and then get another behavior, and there'd be another MDR, and basically they were out of school almost all the time. So if during that interim period, that student was sitting home while we were waiting for that MDR meeting, and it's been determined that, yeah, that was related, that was a manifestation, then yes, they would be entitled to compensatory services for that time that they missed.
Thank you guys so much. We are going to go ahead and wrap up. I'm going to re-share the screen with you. There is a feedback survey. We would really, really appreciate if you all were able to fill this out. We would just want to thank you guys again for joining us this evening. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to Dylan for sharing. There will be a follow-up email coming with all these recordings available to you guys. So thank you and have a great evening.